It's the beginning of the year, and for some of you, you are already full force inside of your classroom meeting with students every day. For others, you're just starting to get into your classroom, starting to think about the structures, where you're going to put your desks, how are you going to organize your classroom, and of course, what are you going to do with all of those bulletin boards? So I wanted to share a little bit about the classrooms that I've had over the years and just some of the really functional areas that I've kept in my rooms, and that means going over my bulletin boards. So this was my classroom last year. This was my fourth grade ELA and social studies classroom, and for those of you that don't know, I have been teaching for around 11 going on 12 years now, and now I have a new position as a staff developer for an IU within Central Pennsylvania. So my focus is really going to be about supporting, coming in, facilitating various components, and also coaching and mentoring and all of those other aspects that bring in that staff developer role to support teachers inside of the classroom. So like I said, this was my classroom last year, and you're going to notice a few different things. I had a giant bulletin board, a giant bulletin board off on the side of my classroom. The other thing that you're going to notice is that I then had a blackboard. A good old-fashioned blackboard inside of my room. I had a smaller bulletin board that I could use here, but when I really think about the overall logistics of how my room was set up, I didn't have a ton of space to really add in a lot of those like learning pieces on my walls. So that was the front of my classroom. Over here was the back of my room. And in the back of my room, I had this giant space back here, and these were our student lockers. So this is where they were putting their backpacks. The top portion was all of the supplies that I kept inside of my classroom. And I tried to utilize this space as much as possible. So this was my overall structure. And so when you really have a limited amount of space, when it comes to your walls, what you're going to be putting up, you really have to be creative and maximize the learning that you're placing onto your walls. This next classroom was my multi-age classroom, and this is where I spent a good chunk of my teaching career. And inside of this classroom, I had very limited space. There were a lot of cabinets, there were a lot of closet doors, there were beautiful windows that were huge and big and bright. And then I had this big, huge space up in the very front of my classroom. I had one whiteboard, and that was it. So I didn't really use a ton of stuff inside of my classroom. I had a bulletin board that was back here, and then I did have a smaller one, which is actually right here. You can see it there. That was right next to the other side of that window. And so that was all I had. And so again, you have to think, well, what is it that I'm going to put up that's going to maximize our learning and really ensure that my students are using the space around them to help them in their learning process? Then I taught kindergarten for 4 years. So this was my favorite classroom. It was such a quirky shape. It had such a cool vibe. There were floor to ceiling windows. It was just an amazing space. And here I had a lot of bulletin boards. I had this giant bulletin board space that was here. I had a whiteboard that I ended up using. It was magnetic, so I used it as my word wall. And then I had another really giant wall board that was one of those partition walls that you could move around. And I had calendars, focus wall, everything that included our learning was on that wall. So I've had all of this experience when it comes to creating a learning environment that really encourages students, supports them in this learning process, but isn't also overwhelming to them. Because that's one of the big pieces here, is that you don't want to overwhelm your students. So I wanted to share with you a few areas that I think might be beneficial as you're starting to prepare your classrooms and structure them in a way that's going to really optimize learning overall. So let's look at the first one. The first one is going to be this welcome board. Now, I was really, really lucky because in this classroom, I had this welcome board right here. And within this welcome board, it was right next to my door. So I had my door right here on that little space. And I really liked that because as soon as my students were able to walk into the door, they had the ability to look at that bulletin board and know what was happening for the day. And so within this welcome board, I try to keep a lot of news, information, announcements that were happening for that specific day. One thing I did is I kept a lunch paper that just kind of told them where the lunch was, how to locate that. I wanted them to become independent, self-sufficient, and that's a really big piece to encourage, especially in upper elementary. I also had our specials and our date that was located for students to be able to reference. And then on this little clipboard here, I kept our schedule. Now, a lot of the times people will have like the individual schedule pieces. I printed it out on paper and then I laminated them, and I had one for each day in our cycle because every day our schedule changed just a little bit. So this made it really easy for me to switch out and be able to reference it as the year went. So that is my welcome board, and I highly recommend it. Inside of my other classrooms, I've used a magnetic board. I had a space right there on a wall, like anywhere where you can find a space just to have information and news and announcements is really going to be important for your students to reference. The other area that I would highly recommend, and this was one of the newer things that I did put into my 4th grade classroom because I didn't have this space readily available in multi-age. I had so much more limited amount of space in my multi-age classroom that I was really excited to use this board in a new way. And so in the beginning of the year, I housed some anchor charts, but as we started going, I realized very quickly an area where my students needed to grow, and that was going to be in grammar. And so I wanted to support them as much as possible. And so we created a grammar wall. So we had parts of speech, we had sentence structures, we had figurative language, we had affixes that were all located on this wall. And this was really going to support them as we were doing mentor sentences, as we were working with our writing, as we were looking at vocabulary. This was often what we were referencing on and on. Now, I will tell you, if you can use this space inside of your classroom, do it, because this was a great wall to have inside of my classroom. One of the things that I will say is that if you look really closely onto this board, I did not have anything super fancy. I printed these out on colored paper. I laminated them, but notice that my definitions were not done. And the reason for that, and for a reason for me using these sentence strips, was because my students helped me in the process of developing meaning with each of these. So we created a definition together as a class. And it was really, really meaningful for them because they were involved in that learning process and they could reference this and start to develop some of those connections. So I kept this very simple and I did not go overboard, but it was a great board to have inside of my classroom. The next wall that I have for you is a vocabulary wall. Now, I love vocabulary. Vocabulary is actually one of those areas in my teaching that I think is incredibly valuable, and it is one that is not done enough inside of classrooms. So with our vocabulary wall, this was actually my multi-age classroom. I used this back on the black above their locker cabinet doors inside of my 4th grade. So it looked very similar, but I couldn't find a picture of that one. So we're going to go with this one. But in my multi-age classroom, I used my doors. And so the doors became our vocabulary wall. And you're going to notice that the biggest piece when it comes to this vocabulary wall is that I'm using pictures of their mentor text. So as I read the mentor text, I would just go online, I would Google an image, I would throw it into Google Slides, and then adjust the sizing however I wanted it. I would print them out, laminate them, cut them, and then I could use them here. I just had a simple template that I used for the words that I could quickly type in, and then again, just cutting them out, laminating them, that kind of thing. And so as I would introduce the mentor text and we would go over our vocabulary, I would then add the mentor text along with that vocabulary to the door. And what that did is allowed our students to make connections, because the moment they were able to connect that word to the picture, they were able to remember the sentence that it came from, and then help them to develop a deeper meaning and understanding of that meaning by developing that connection. And then from there, they were able to then utilize that word within a sentence, or helping them to understand a different type of text where they're identifying that word in a text. So this was a great wall to have inside of my classroom. I will tell you that one of the key things that I would highly recommend is to, on the back of your pictures, of your vocabulary words, write the unit, write the lesson that it's coming from, and then that way you have a better way of organizing it, and you can reuse that every single year, and you don't have to worry about trying to redo it every year, because that is very much a struggle, and you don't want to have to do that. That way you could just pull them out, put them up, and you're ready to go. So great wall to have overall, because it's really going to enhance that vocabulary. The other thing that I will say is to use a vocabulary jar. Now, this was something that I was taught from a third grade teacher, and she had a jar. Well, she didn't have a jar. She had like a caterpillar that went into her classroom. And what she did is that as students would identify that vocabulary word in their independent reading, they would add that word to the caterpillar. And then they would, throw a party after so much. So if you utilize a jar, you can take like those big pom-poms, and then every time a student identifies one of the vocabulary words that you've discussed in their independent reading, allow them to share it to the class, add a pom-pom to that jar, and if they fill the jar up to a certain point, you can have a class reward or a class party or something to that extent. The students really love that, and that really does encourage them to utilize that vocabulary so much more, and they're looking for it, which is great. So just some really fun ways for you to encourage vocabulary overall. Now, this is going to be one that I created. I love read alouds. So read aloud time is one of my favorite times in my classrooms. It's a time for you to build community. It's a time for you to really engulf inside of a book and encourage students to be thinking about stories and to have conversations about wonderful stories. And for you to also model a lot of these skills and strategies that you're doing with much smaller text during your mini lessons, but then during a really big chapter, you're also showing them how you're taking those skills and strategies and applying it to that text. So during my read aloud time, which is typically about 15 or 20 minutes, and it's outside of my reading block, which is key here, I will fill out a read aloud tracker. And so this is a tracker that is available in my store so that you guys can go and check it out. I'm going to put some links down in the description box. But what it does is it really helps to identify the elements of plot. And one of the most challenging aspects when it really comes to a chapter book is identifying those elements, because plot in a chapter book doesn't just do this. Plot in a chapter book does this. It has so many more jaggeds. There's like high moment, low moment, high moment, low moment, high low moment. There are so many little bitty more conflicts that are happening throughout that you want to build and have that discussion with your students. So we use this plot map to really encourage that discussion. And so for each one of these pieces here, so you can see that piece, this one here, this circle here, and for each of those circles, what I do is I identify those as one of those like higher peaks that's happening. So these really high peaks that are kind of happening throughout it. What I'm trying to do here is just help them in filling out some of these pieces. Now you can do this yourself, or you can encourage students to come up and do it. So as you're having some of these discussions and you're identifying some of these as you're going through your reading, encourage your students to come up to the classroom and start filling some of these pieces in. I will say I even had a class who was very artistic. And so this class loved to draw the characters. And so as I was reading the story, a lot of them would draw the characters, and then we would have a vote on which drawing we should place next to each of the character pieces, so that we could kind of share what it was. So you would have a character drawing that was right there of that character that we were identifying within that story. Again, it's just another really great way to involve your students. The other thing that I did is I started to utilize this conflict area. And so what I did with the conflict area is, again, with chapter books, you're going to have lots of conflicts that are happening. You're going to have internal, external. There's so many different pieces to them. So again, you want to identify those. And so I used sticky notes to identify the type of conflict, and then I would just add that sticky note to that conflict poster, and we would keep track of it as we were reading. See why it's called a read aloud tracker? You're tracking the reading that you're doing during your read aloud. But this was really great because the kids were always involved in it, and it was a great way for you to come back and do like a refresher, especially if you have students who are out and they're like, wait a second, what did I miss? And you're like, well, let's go to the read aloud tracker and see where we're at. So it was a great way for you to just build those connections with your students. Another area inside of your classroom that you cannot be without is going to be a focus wall. Now, my focus wall is not fancy, and it doesn't have to be fancy. The complete goal of your focus wall is to focus the learning that is occurring in your classroom. And so you're going to notice here, I had an essential question that I just did with some vinyl on a Cricut, and then I placed that onto my blackboard. Underneath that, I would just use simple chalk where I would write my essential question, but then you're going to notice that I have learning targets, because our essential question would end up lasting a week, 2 weeks at a time. And so to really help focus that a little bit more, I started using those learning targets right underneath my essential question, and that really helped to guide the specific lesson that we were working on that day. And so we always knew that these learning targets were directly going back to that essential question. And so when my students were then responding to their essential question at the end of the week or at the end of 2 weeks, they then were able to bring back a lot of these learning targets. And so you would hear that language in their responses, which was very empowering. And what I like about having an essential question here is that it's really going to help focus your lesson so that when you're speaking with them and you're showing and modeling something, you know exactly what you need to be doing. And if you really start to focus those learning targets on very small, tangible pieces, like the smallest increment of learning possible, those component skills that we're looking at, that's then going to help them with this bigger essential question at the end. And again, it's going to help focus your instruction so that you don't feel like you're going all over the place. So here's what I would recommend. I would recommend putting this in an area inside of your classroom where it's right where you're going to be teaching. So you're going to see that this right here, this little spot right there, that is a projector screen. And so that's where the learning was happening inside of my classroom. And I had it right next to my projector screen. And that just made sure that we were always referencing it as we were going through the learning process. Another area that I really like to bring in my students and encourage them to participate are going to be genre posters. Now, genres is a very important area, especially in upper elementary, as you start to develop more of that academic language, as you start to help students identify some of those elements and where to focus themselves as readers when they're reading particular genres. And it also helps them as writers as well, so that they understand what are those elements that I need to include in my own writing depending on the genre that they're going to be writing. So what I did at the beginning of the year is I would incorporate an activity that's called Journey Through the Genres. Again, it's something else that is available within my store. I'll leave a link so that you guys can check it out. But one of the big pieces is that after we had some time to familiarize ourselves with the genres, I would put them into teams. I would give them some different research areas. So I would give them a resource online. They would have a paper resource. I would give them some various books that they were able to explore. And then they were able to create a poster for the classroom. And so within that poster, they had the title of the genre and then all of the different elements that went along with that genre. And so once they were done, we were able to just put it with some Dollar Tree frames, and I just posted those up inside of my classroom. And again, what I really like is that it allowed me to build community with my students. So here you can kind of see it a little bit bigger here. So they had a title and then they had all of these other element pieces to it. So it built community and they felt as though they were part of the classroom as well, that it was their classroom because they contributed to a lot of what we were doing here in our learning. So that's kind of our genre poster area. It was right next to my classroom library, and it was something that we referenced all year long as we were exploring various genres. Another area that I had inside of my classroom was the 40 book challenge area. Now, I really encouraged my students, because we did a lot with genres, to explore a variety of genres in their challenge. So they had the opportunity to go through a 40 book challenge. I incorporated this with our book talks. You can see the 40 book challenge is also right next to our book talks here. And so within this 40 book challenge, I just used some rods from Walmart. These are magnetic rods. And I used some very cheap rings that I got from Walmart as well. I put their names on them, and this would just allow them to keep track of the books that they were reading. So I had these little bitty squares of just their index cards that I cut up. I cut index cards up by thirds, and then they would hang these on their rings to represent each book that they read. And so as they would start to read a variety of genres, they would then add some different, I guess labels is what you could call them, to show that they had mastered or completed that specific genre. This was an idea that I definitely got from Hello Fifth. She is a great resource. She has a free resource, in fact, for this, and I will leave a link for that as well, because this is something that I used a lot. Now, if you're interested in some of the book talk resources, I also have some resources for that you can look at. That's going to be available for you down in the description box. Let's talk about mentor sentences, because mentor sentences is the best way to help build grammar and syntax and punctuation understanding with your students. And so if you're not utilizing mentor sentences, I highly recommend them. They're fantastic. Now, I will tell you that a lot of the resources that you're gonna find online when it comes to mentor sentences, whether it's the imitating, the revising, and all of those other pieces where you have paper products to go with it, I don't do that. I do this one day a week. And so every day a week, we would look at our mentor sentence and we would dive deep into it. This wasn't something that I added on to my lessons because I had a very short amount of time for my literacy block. So I didn't have a ton of time and I wasn't able to revisit this every single day. So instead of doing something a little bit every day, I just spent an entire day focusing on a mentor sentence. And that really did help my students overall when it came to their understanding of grammar. And so with the mentor sentence, again, I had it on my blackboard. I just used some vinyl up at the top to be able to label that. If I had it on a whiteboard, I would do the same thing, just with some black vinyl. Then I would just write it onto a whiteboard with dry erase marker versus chalk. And so what's nice about this is that we were able to reference this as we would go along through the week. And so I kept this learning up for my students so that they could reference it. And so I would write the sentence from the mentor text that we were reading that week, and then we would identify various things. We would identify parts of speech, capitalization, punctuation, the syntax. We would look at ways for us to be able to look at different spelling patterns. So that was another big piece here. So here you could see we looked at A, I, E, and OW. And so we started to create a word list for each of those. So this very much encompassed not just grammar, but also my word study. And this was a great way for us to kind of build that conversation and revisit that on this specific day. The last area that I would encourage you to have inside of your classrooms are going to be a space for you to add anchor charts. Now, when I say anchor charts, I'm not talking the big chart paper. I did that for years. I did it in kindergarten. I did it when I moved into multi-age. And then after a little bit of multi-age, I ended up transitioning to 11 by 14 paper. So I used legal size cardstock, which works really, really well because you can make it online, you can print it out, and you can allow your students to be able to reference it there. And then I also used, I believe it's 9 by 12 construction paper. And so I bought a big piece of just the white construction paper. And this is where a lot of the things that my students were doing in collaborative groups. So here they were working with different text structures, but they would organize their work together as a group onto this paper, and that allowed me to be able to post it for my students to be able to preview it. Now, I used this space at the back of my room last year. In previous years, I just put it in front of windows. I put it wherever I had the ability to be able to put it. I was really limited on the space itself, but you make it work when you need to make it work. So I highly recommend that if you have not started really transitioning from the big chart paper to moving over to these like legal size or the larger size construction paper, I encourage you to give it a shot because it's so much easier and it's such a space saver than using those really big pieces of chart paper. Now, it's not to say that I did not use those big pieces of chart paper because I did. I used it a lot, but it was very rare that I would post it inside of my classroom for an extended period of time because I didn't have the space for it. At the end of the day, you really just want to think about creating a space that's going to be simple and effective for your students. You want to keep things very clean and limited so that your students don't feel as though they're bouncing from one thing to another inside of your classroom. When you develop that purpose, it really helps to encourage your students in their learning process. For example, if they were working on a grammar assignment or a warm-up that included grammar, they knew where to look inside of my room. I wasn't constantly changing things out for them because then that would distract them. They wouldn't really know where to look and how to find things. So I kept everything very, very basic all year long, and I kept the same stuff up all year long, especially the areas that I felt as though my students needed more encouragement in. So whether it was the vocabulary or the grammar, those big pieces are going to be the areas that I was focusing on with my learners the most. And so I kept those up all year, and we just constantly referenced and added to them. The more that I showed them how to utilize that space inside of the classroom, the more likely they were to using it while they were working independently. So there you go, guys. Those are going to be some of the spaces that I would recommend for you inside of your literacy classrooms. I would love to know what are some areas that you have in your rooms, or if you're going to be including any of these, you can throw those into the comment section below, and I will catch you all next time.